Mr. Majewski's Anatomy 32 class lecture, Chapter 15, the lymphatic system. So, the lymphatic system is another collection of tube-like structures that carry fluids throughout the body. It's sort of like the cardiovascular system's little brother. And so that means the functions of it include basically draining excess interstitial fluid. So it's taking fluids that are accumulating around the cells of the body and then carrying them back into the bloodstream. It's also involved in the transport of dietary lipids. So around our digestive system, the lymphatic system will collect the fatty substances that our body absorbs and carry them to the liver. And it also is involved in the immune responses, especially the maturation of the lymphocytes. So, in the lymphatic system, it's actually a long one-way street rather than a circle. The beginning of this long one-way street are in the lymphatic capillaries. They are very tiny. They're associated with where our blood capillaries are, and they basically collect excess fluid. So as that interstitial fluid comes into the lymphatic capillaries, it's now known as lymph. So where did this fluid come to begin with? Well, it came out of the bloodstream. Turns out capillaries, the blood capillaries, release more fluid than they reabsorb. So over time, that's going to build up. The capillaries are basically made up of overlapping endothelial cells, as you can sort of see here. And as the amount of interstitial fluid increases, the pressure on this tube-like structure also increases, and eventually the endothelial cells will push in, making an open space that allows the interstitial fluid to flow in and become lymph. However, to make sure that those poor lymphatic capillaries aren't moved around and shifted and all that, they also have what are called anchor filaments, and these filaments, these protein structures, help attach the lymphatic capillaries to the surrounding tissue so they stay in place. So, over time, the capillaries will fuse to form larger structures known as lymph vessels. And these lymphatic vessels will then eventually fuse to form one of the 8 lymphatic trunks. And here you can see the left and lower portion of the body's trunks. You have one lumbar trunk, one intestinal trunk. There's a right and left brachiomediastinal trunk, a right and left subclavian trunk, and a right and left jugular trunk. And then these trunks will fuse to form one of the 2 lymphatic ducts, either the right lymphatic duct or the thoracic duct, which the right lymphatic duct is draining the lymph fluid from the upper right portion of the body, while the thoracic duct is draining pretty much all the rest of the body. So the ducts then join with the veins of our body, specifically at the junction between our subclavian and internal jugular veins, and then return the lymph fluid to the bloodstream so that it can then be carried throughout the body and be part of the plasma of the bloodstream. So basically the way this one-way road works is you start with the blood capillaries, and they push fluid out into the interstitial spaces. This builds up and eventually gets pushed by pressure into the lymphatic capillaries. These capillaries are microscopic. The lymphatic capillaries then fuse to form lymphatic vessels, which are bigger than capillaries but still pretty small. These lymphatic vessels then fuse to form the trunks, which are lymphatic trunks are bigger than the vessels, and the lymphatic trunks will then fuse to form one of the 2 lymphatic ducts, which are the biggest lymphatic vessels. And then the lymphatic ducts will return the fluid to the bloodstream via the junction of the internal jugular and subclavian veins. So there's not a lot of pressure for the fluids in the lymphatic system, so basically it takes advantage of some natural quote-unquote pumps of our body. The first of these is the skeletal muscle pump. So basically whenever we contract our skeletal muscles, they bulge a little bit, and this will squeeze the lymphatic vessels, pushing the lymph along the vessels. And then we also have the respiratory pump, which basically is just the fact that as we breathe in, our lungs expand, and this expansion will also help to squeeze lymphatic vessels, pushing the lymph fluid along in the vessels. Now, the way that the lymphatic system prevents backflow of the lymph fluid is pretty much the same as we found in the veins of the cardiovascular system, and that is that the lymph vessels contain many valves that will fill up and close up if the lymph fluid tries to back up. So if you have problems with the flow of your lymph fluid, you can develop what's called an edema, which is an abnormal increase in the interstitial volume. So you can see here this woman's left leg is experiencing the edema while her right leg is normal. Quite a lot of swelling. And this can be caused by either excess filtration of fluid from the blood capillaries, so too much fluid is leaving the bloodstream, and or it's caused by inefficient absorption of the fluid into the lymphatic capillaries. So either too much is coming out or not enough is going into the lymphatic system. This can be caused by damage to the lymphatic system itself. It can be caused by abnormalities. It can be caused by parasites. So there are also, besides the vessels, a number of organs and tissues important to the lymphatic system. These include the primary lymphatic organs, which are the red bone marrow and the thymus, and the secondary lymphatic organs and tissues, which are the lymph nodes, the spleen, and the lymphatic nodules, which includes the tonsils. And the primary lymphatic organs are special because they are where you produce immunocompetent cells. So leukocytes that are, or specifically lymphocytes that are going to mature and be ready to engage in immune responses. So, as I'm sure you remember from chapter 12, we see that this table shows us the differentiation of a pluripotent stem cell into the different kinds of blood cells. And specific for the lymphatic system, we see that in the red bone marrow, you produce the T lymphoblasts and the B lymphocytes. And then the T lymphoblasts and the B lymphocytes will leave and enter the bloodstream to continue on their path to get to the correct portion of the body. So here you see immunocompetent cells being formed in the red bone marrow. So the B cells, what is their primary function? Well, it turns out that after they differentiate into plasma cells, usually in lymph nodes, they then begin producing antibodies, and these antibodies will latch onto infectious agents, allowing the body to destroy those agents and hopefully make us better. As for the T cells, there turns out there are 4 types of T cells. There's the T helper cells. These cells act in concert with the B cells and help to amplify the amount of antibody produced. You get the T regulatory cells. They turn off the immune response. If we turn it on, we have to be able to turn it off when we don't need it anymore. You get the T memory cells. These cells have a long life, and they can remember the antigens that led to an immune response in the past, so that in the future, if we get infected with the same agent, we should be able to have a vigorous response that could potentially prevent us from getting ill. And then there's the T cytotoxic cells, also known as natural killer cells, and they destroy target cells of the body, usually cells that are showing abnormalities such as cancer or being infected with viruses. So, and another important lymph organ is the thymus. The thymus is found in the mediastinum. It's this big yellowishy sort of clump. And the important thing about the thymus is it is the site of T cell maturation. So here is where we develop those 4 different kinds of T cells. And it turns out as a person ages, the amount of lymph node tissue they have decreases and is replaced by fatty tissue. So that basically over time, in the thymus for instance, you'll get a reduced amount of function because there's a reduced amount of tissue that actually can help cause T cells to differentiate. And this is part of why elderly people are more susceptible to illnesses. Now we talk about the lymph nodes. These are organs. They're organs because they are a small mass of lymphatic tissue that is surrounded by a connective tissue capsule. And so remember, organs have 2 or more tissues working for a purpose. So these lymph nodes are found throughout the vessels of the lymphatic system. There's large groups of them in the mammary gland area, the armpit, and the groin. So if those places get swollen, that's a good chance that you have an infection. And basically the lymph arrives by the afferent lymphatic tissues, goes through the lymph node to be filtered, and then leaves or exits by the efferent lymphatic vessels. Inside the lymph node, you see that there are a lot of protein fibers that end up forming this mesh-like structure. And this mesh helps to filter the lymph and traps foreign substances, infectious agents, and so forth, to then be taken care of by the macrophages and other leukocytes. This is also the site where B cells are exposed to antigens and begin to form specific antibodies. So here in the lymph nodes is where the whole antibody production begins. And it turns out that lymph fluid, as it flows through the lymph vessels, is filtered multiple times. So it goes through a number of lymph nodes. The spleen in my mind is a sad little organ, all squished and tucked in on the side, but it is very important. It has two kinds of functional tissues. It has the lighter colored tissues called the white pulp, and here is where you'll find the B cells, the T cells, and macrophages carrying out the immune functions of the body. So here's another place where you get protein production, you get phagocytosis of infectious agents, and so forth. And then in the red pulp, the darker surrounding tissue, it has three functions. At least at one time it had three. In adults, it only has two. The first function is removal by macrophages of ruptured, worn out, and defective red blood cells and platelets. Those cells die, get damaged, so forth. Got to recycle them. It's also a storage site for platelets in case of a huge release of blood. And it is the production of blood cells during fetal life. Lymph nodules. Lymph nodules are lymphatic tissues that are in sort of an egg-shaped mass. However, they are not surrounded by a capsule of connective tissue, so they're glands, not organs. They can be found alone in different areas of the body or in large groups. In large groups, they tend to be near the appendix, around the ileum region of the small intestine. Here it would then be called the aggregated lymphatic follicle. And then also around the pharyngeal region of the throat. And here they are referred to as tonsils, where you have one pharyngeal tonsil, two palatine tonsils, and two lingual tonsils. Disorders. Well, if your spleen gets hit hard enough by some sort of force, it can lead to hemorrhaging, and the person could go into shock. If it's a serious enough damage to the spleen, it's treated by splenectomy, the removal of the spleen. But unfortunately, this causes a reduced functionality of the person's immune system. Another disorder is tonsillitis. This is a persistent inflammation of the tonsils, often caused by a virus infection. And the treatment for this is tonsillectomy. So one infectious disease that targets our immune system is AIDS. Well, it's HIV. The HIV virus targets helper T cells, infects them, and ends up eventually taking them over and destroying them, which will cause the immune system to collapse and lead to opportunistic infections. So the HIV infection goes through 3 stages. You have the acute stage. It's usually pretty short, a few days. The person develops flu-like symptoms. There's the asymptotic stage. It can last for many years. There's no obvious symptoms. However, the HIV is slowly destroying helper T cells and spreading throughout the body. And then the final stage is AIDS, which is a complete collapse of the immune system, leading to all kinds of opportunistic infections that could then kill the person. Treatment of this disease is currently done by a drug cocktail of medications that are antiviral medications. And these are pretty heavy, hard-hitting medications and often lead to many side effects. So ideally, you should practice safe sex and not contract HIV. That's it for this lecture. I hope you enjoyed it.